What comes to mind when you say the Sultan's wife? Luxury, splendor from the TV series Magnificent Century, bright passions, numerous servants are ready to fulfill any whim. But in fact, you would never agree to marry the Sultan and become his beloved wife. What did the girls have to endure to get into the harem? What had to be done to become a legitimate spouse? Why would a glittering palace of top cops really terrify you? Were there weekends in the harem, and what did the Sultan's wives do all day so that it seemed to you the hardest to bear? Why would the dream of all the concubines of the harem become a real nightmare for you? And why were those who gave birth to the Sultan's son no longer allowed on Halvet? Meet our heroine, the same harem from the TV series Magnificent Century. It would seem that she became not just one of the Sultan's wives, but the beloved, adored wife of one of the brightest Ottoman rulers in history. Suleiman even created a special title for her, Hoziki. That's just to become the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. She had to go through an incredible amount of trials. To begin with, she was abducted from her native home by Tatars, deprived of her family, as a disenfranchised slave was taken to slave markets. Imagine what it's like to be stolen from your home and put up for auction. The girls in the slave markets were divided into two parts. Those who were not distinguished by beauty and attractiveness wore only an iron collar. They were sold in a maidservant or in a harem from not particularly wealthy Turks. Those who, like our heroines, were beautiful, lived in different conditions. They were beautifully dressed, well fed. After several resales, she became a gift for Shahzad Suleiman, and the doors of the harem were closed for the 15-year-old girl forever. This is where the girl she once was disappeared forever, and harem, translated from Persian, was born, bringing joy, cheerful. But who is hiding behind the name harem? Poles are sure that her real name is Alexandra, and she is the daughter of the Rogatinsky priest Gavrila Lisovsky. However, this version appeared only in the 19th century in literature. A participant in the embassy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the Ottoman Sultan at the beginning of the 17th century, Samuel Twardowski, wrote that, according to the Turks themselves, Roxolana was the daughter of an Orthodox priest and Foroatin. This is a modern value. But in fact, in Europe, harem was known as Roxolana. This is how the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, Aigir de Buzbek, is called in his Turkish notes published in 1589, Roxolana, because she allegedly comes from Sirani. But Roxolania in Western sources of that time was often called Rus. The Venetian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Bernard Navager, also called harem directly Russian. How did our young heroine see the palace of Topkapi? I'm afraid you won't like it. It was not at all such an attractive place as in the TV series Magnificent Century. In fact, the Topkapi palace was a terrifying place. There were severed heads hanging on two columns, and there was a special fountain for the executioners so that they could wash their hands after such ordinary things as executions, which took place here regularly. And in the courtyard of the palace, during the constant purges of the objectionable and guilty, whole mounds of tongues were piled up at all. Not only officials, servants, and concubines, but also members of the Sultan's family lived in the Topkapi palace under constant threat of death. And since it was impossible to shed Sultan's blood, they were simply strangled. Even for the Sultan himself, life here was not sugar. The atmosphere in the palace was poisoned by intrigues. Here everyone was fighting for power, courtiers, servants and, of course, the inhabitant of the harem. Well, the hardest thing, probably, for a modern person, is that here you could never be alone with yourself. All this fully applied to the Sultan's wives. All their lives they spent in four walls, surrounded by a huge number of servants. They had the right to go out only accompanied, again, by numerous maids and assistants. Sultan Ahmed III complained to his Grand Vizier, "If I move from one room to another, 40 people line up in the corridor at the same time. When I get dressed, the guards are watching me. I can never be alone." Can you imagine? At the same time, the ruler was forced to spend most of his life in absolute silence. It was believed that it was indecent for the Sultan to talk too much, and a special sign language was invented for him. When one of the sultans, Mustafa I, who was simply driven mad by this eternal silence, tried to cancel it, his subordinates categorically rebelled against it. As a result, the poor sultan really went crazy. He often came to the seashore and threw coins into the water so that at least the fish would spend them somewhere. Here is such an oriental fairy tale. Our heroine, having had a bitter share of the captive, decided to survive here at all costs. She immediately began to study hard. If you think that the concubines have been idling all day waiting for the Sultan to call them to his bed, then you are mistaken. They worked a lot, cleaned, put things in order, besides they had to take a course of study. And not only those simple sciences that you have thought about, but also studied the Quran with the application and much, much more. Hurrem was a smart girl and studied much harder than others. As a result, she completed a 5-year course in just 2 years, as an external. Her mind, as many believe, was what attracted the almighty Sultan so much. She wrote amazing poems, and their correspondence shows that she was also the main political advisor to Suleiman the Magnificent. But she was still a long way from that moment. So far, she had to solve the main task to become not a disenfranchised slave, but the wife of the master. And there was only one way here. It was necessary to give birth to his son. It would seem that nothing is complicated, but in fact the task is not easy. In order to become not a concubine, but the lawful wife of the Lord, the lady had to do several unthinkable things, and the first of them was to be in his bed. Yes, it was a rare piece of luck, considering that there were so many concubines that some of them almost never caught the eye of the Lord. Their number at certain times reached up to 2,000. Well, the most important condition, it was also necessary to give birth to a child, and then get approval and a special letter from the Lord. The women who gave birth to the ruler's sons were called Kaden Effendi, and they were considered the legitimate wives of the Sultan. Pregnant women from the Sultan, who had not yet had children, were called Iqbal. The eldest wife was the one who gave birth to the very first son. Kaden Effendi. From now on, the surrounding people had to call Your Highness. They also had separate rooms, and their own room in the harem was a real luxury, because the rest lived in a shared bedroom. His wife received expensive gifts and many maids, and from now on an individual menu of 15 dishes was made up for her. Hurrem was able to decide quickly enough. She managed to attract the Sultan's attention and even end up in his bedroom. Just 2 years after she found herself in the harem. But now the young slave had to win a place for herself, and most importantly, to survive in this picture with snakes, which was called a harem. In fact, life in the harem is not at all like the one shown in the series. The rules that prevailed in this giant women's dormitory, too, would hardly have pleased you. If you think that the Sultan's chief wife is in charge here, you are mistaken. The Sultan's mother, Valide, was in charge of everything here. She was the main one, and even who would spend the night with the Sultan was often decided by his mother, too. But after the mother in importance were the wives of Kaden Fendi. Jerry's slaves were ordinary residents of the harem. But the life of the Sultan's official spouses was strictly regulated. For non-compliance with written and unwritten rules and traditions, the wife could be expelled or even executed. According to strict rules, even a halvet was held, a night with the Sultan. So, he was obliged to spend the sacred night from Thursday with his eldest wife or his most beloved. According to tradition, the Lord was obliged to spend an equal amount of time with each of his wives. But the sultans, of course, violated these rules. So Ahmed spent almost all the time with his beloved Kizem and Suleiman, with our heroine Hurrem. Surviving in the harem, of course, was not easy. The mores were cruel. Carried away by the new concubine, the sultan could simply execute the bored old one, order her to be thrown into the sea in a leather bag or order her to be strangled. And the inhabitant of the harem themselves did not disdain any means in the struggle for the love of the sultan and for power. So our heroine got jealous and brutally beat Mahidevran, the mother of the sultan's son and the main wife at that time. This is how the Venetian ambassador Bernard Navager describes this episode. Cherkshenko insulted Hurrem and tore her face, hair and dresses. It should be noted that Hurrem is still very lucky. Mahidevran just beat her up. After all, she helped to poison quietly, which also happened. But the eldest wife of Sultan Injim Kamed Gulshan Sultan, out of jealousy, completely threw a rival for his heart off a steep cliff during a picnic. Hurrem also had very difficult ones. It was rumored that the mother turned her son against her, and that it was Valide who insisted that her son be sent by Hurrem Sultan, who already had a son from the ruler at that time. Indeed, after the birth of his daughter, Miraima Suleiman sent Hurrem from the palace to the hunting lodge. Our heroine did not understand why, but she left the harem with her head held high, without saying a word. And in response to his letters, she humbly wrote to him that she was ready to accept any of his wishes. After that, the Sultan returned our heroine to the palace, and the next day it became known that she was expecting a son. If a concubine managed to get pregnant after a night of love, she prayed that a son would be born. This was perceived as the greatest happiness and meant that she would greatly improve her standard of living. The woman who gave the Sultan a son immediately turned from an ordinary Khatan into a sultana. However, in their place, our contemporaries would actually not be very happy. The thing is that at that time there was a harsh law of Fatiha, according to which the new sultan was obliged to execute all his half-brothers, including babies. Can you imagine? There is another point here. According to the rules of the Ottoman harem, a concubine who pulled out lucky tickets and gave birth to a son was no longer allowed to visit the sultan on halvet. Something like one concubine, one son. They, of course, became sultans, received luxurious gifts, separate rooms. But if it was not about beloved wives, then they were deprived of the right to meet with the padishah. From now on, the only task of such a spouse was only the upbringing of her son. Of course, such arrangements made it possible to prevent the wife from gaining too much power over the ruler. Valide Sultan tried to send exclusively new girls to her son every time, and those who had already visited Halva, those, not to mention those who had given birth, could walk the golden path twice in exceptional cases when they managed to win the heart of the ruler. The beloved concubine appeared in the sultan's chambers as often as he wanted, and no rules of the harem affected this. So it was with Ahmed and Kizim, Salim and Nurbanu, and of course, with our heroine and Suleiman. All these women, in spite of everything, were able to go through an incredibly difficult path and become a sultana. They not only managed to give birth to several children by their lord, but they were able to become legitimate wives for them. And Nurbanu and Kizim managed, so to speak, to reach even the Valide. Then, if a girl was born, her mother, of course, also received gifts, more modestly. Separate rooms were allocated. But she did not receive the coveted status of a sultana and the prefix to her name sultan. If after the birth of the girls, the lord no longer showed interest in the concubine, years later she could even get a good dowry, get married and leave the harem. But she could no longer take her daughter away, but she remained in the palace. And there was only one advantage for the girls who gave birth. The rule of one concubine, one son did not apply to them. The girl's mom could get another chance. So Niger Khatun, who was a concubine of Sultan Bayezid II, first gave birth to his daughter in Fatma, but it seems that the sultan invited her to his rest again and again, because then she gave birth to one or two more children to him. What kind of relationship did the sultan have with his legitimate wives in the harem? Everything was very strict here, too. Even official wives had no right to talk without his will. They could not sit down until he gave them permission to do so. When they had to pass by the sultan, they had to take off their outer clothing and give it to the maid. Ordinary concubines of the harem spent almost all their time in four walls. While they had no time for idleness, they either worked or studied. A day off for all the inhabitants of the harem was arranged only twice a year. At this time, they were completely released from work and study and could spend the whole day outdoors on a kind of picnic in the garden, where special treats and sweets were already prepared for them. Well, the legitimate wives of the sultan, of course, were always released from work. Their main occupation was taking care of their appearance and especially their hair, as they were considered the main tool for attracting the attention of a spouse. Another reason why few modern women would agree to become the sultan's beloved wife is that they could easily be separated from their children. The heroine of harem managed to stand out from the general mass and win the sultan's favor. And finally, to pull out the so-called lucky ticket, she gave birth to his son. She was about 17 at the time. Sultan Suleiman, who had just returned from a campaign, called the boy Mehmed. It would seem that I have achieved everything I wanted, live and rejoice. But the baby was born prematurely, 7 months old. The doctors kept talking about his mother's painful womb. Of course, this offended our heroine very much. But then her child was also taken away from her. Suleiman's mother, Walid Hassa Sultan, decided that Hurrem was not able to nurse her newborn grandson, and she was only allowed to visit her young son occasionally. Can you imagine what it's like to take out a mother? When Hurrem was in mourning for her second son, one of the Sanjak Beys presented the Sultan with beautiful Russian concubines. In Lida, she immediately ordered to send one of them to the Sultan's halvet. When Hurrem heard that some concubine was being prepared for a night with her lover, she made such a scandal for the whole palace that even the Sultan found out about it, who, it turns out, was not aware that a concubine was going to be brought to him in the evening. When he came to Hurrem, Times said that either the Russian slaves or she would leave. The Sultan even forced his mother to apologize to Hurrem and take the concubine back. And only after the death of Suleiman's mother, Hassa, Hurrem was able to properly strengthen her position in the palace and achieve the unthinkable. The slave officially became Suleiman's wife. The whole tradition of the Ottoman court was against it. However, their wedding took place and looked incredibly lavish. The unique position of Hurrem was also reflected by her title, Hoziki, introduced by the amorous Suleiman especially for her. Well, now remember everything I just told you about, and tell me, would you agree to go through everything that Hurrem went through, starting with the Tatar raid and ending with survival in the harem?